Okay, there you go.
Okay, I think we're good to go. So take it away, Alex.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Welcome to this second session of our seminar series, Being Singular. We had a great start with Martin Donahoe, whom we again thank for this beautiful introduction on Hegel's notion of individuality. This is a seminar series organized by Gregory Scott Moss from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and myself. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And today and tomorrow we have two guests, which I believe will start a very interesting dialogue because in a way I'm very happy to have them in our seminar series because let's face it, there is a certain monistic attitude underlying our series, and that's why I'm very happy to have Michael Della Rocca, who will speak tomorrow with and who's a very prominent scholar of Spinozist and Parmenidean philosophy. He wrote a beautiful book on Parmenides, a beautiful book on Spinoza. And today we have studied Stathis Gourgouris, who's a professor at Columbia University of New York, um, an expert in literary theory and philosophy. He's at the crossroads of many different disciplines. And I will only mention three books he has written. The first one is Lessons in Secular Criticism, which is also the name he gave to a long project he's been working on. The second book that's part of this project is the book that, so to say, made me interested in his work. It's The Perils of the One, where there is a very beautiful statement, namely that the one and the singular are actually opposite, so to say. So that singularity is has nothing to do with the one, which is a very interesting claim for a monist such as Gregory, I can imagine. So we are very interested in having you here a little bit as a critical element to an undergoing theoretical atmosphere we all share with our Hegelian dialectical monism or something similar. And recently studied Professor Stathis Gourgouris has also published another his latest book, Nothing Sacred, also by Columbia University Press. Is that right?
Yeah, I actually have it
Uh,
here, but as Martin had last time, here
Perfect.
it is.
Yeah. Let's just show. Perfect.
Just came out
Let's
literally,
just
literally,
yeah.
literally, actually last week. Last week.
Perfect. Let's show the books. We did it also last time, and that's why we are so happy to have you with us today. Thank you for your participation. We look forward to your paper, and the title of your talk is "The Question of Listening," and I believe that's what we're going to do now. So, Stathis, thank you again for having accepted our invitation. You have the floor, and I believe you also wanted to clarify that it's perfectly okay if we have question or if we want to intervene during your talk. We have more or less 1 hour and a half. We can use them however we want. So please let us know how you want this to be done, and we are going to listen to you with much pleasure. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Gregory and Alessandro, for this invitation. It's a real honor. I decided to talk about something that I'm just now beginning to work on. So I'm taking this risk instead of going back to some of the material that would be perhaps more immediately relevant. That's in the books that Alessandro mentioned. So what I'm going to do is somewhat informal. I'm taking the notion of the seminar quite seriously. I don't want to just lecture on the screen. I will basically run this as a seminar with the exception of a middle part that I have written out that's specifically on Foucault, which I will read. I don't mind being interrupted if you feel that somehow something is pressing that you want to stop me and ask me to elaborate or whatever, please do so. So a couple of preliminary remarks about how I would how I feel that I come into this discussion. The first one is it's kind of personal. I mean, I remember my very first engagement with the concept of singularity was in extensive conversations with my teacher, Samuel Weber. And this gives you an idea how far back this was, since Sam is my teacher. Once one is a teacher, is always a teacher. In any case, Sam has written a very interesting book in French, Singularité, which I suggest if you haven't read, it might be interesting reading. And Sam is a very interesting thinker. He comes from, of course, from Adorno initially, and is in some ways a Derridian thinker, but rather I think sui generis in his thinking. In any case. I remember our discussions back then were really around much closer to how singularity would have something to do with Derrida's notion of iterability. And so that is to say, kind of, in that sense, a singular instance is an instance of non-reproducibility, which I want to read in an enhanced way to problematize the very notion of reproduction and all of the effects already and meanings it suggests from ideology to sexuality, etc. But here I depart, at the same time, sort of perhaps contra Derrida, I'm interested in substitutability, a kind of radical equivalence that does not efface difference, that recognizes that singularities of difference without, however, granting them metaphysical status. A lot of this is elaborated in Nothing Sacred, in The Pearls of the One. Now, why is that? Why am I interested in that? I can tell you it's entirely a political concern. So the kind of radical democracy I argue for, a politics without arche, literally anarchic politics where there's no origin nor end nor telos, and any actualization is just a moment of decision, a politics that creates forms, actualizes itself, but also passes immediately, that sort of in this anarchic democracy, a position of arche can be occupied by anyone and everyone, regardless, without exception, and only provisionally, which means that everyone is in this respect substitutable, regardless of reducible differences per se, regardless of otherness. Is this a way to understand singularity? I don't know. Good question. This would be something that we can discuss. You tell me, and I quite mean this, actually. The second preliminary thought, Alessandro sort of mentioned it already, the relation between singularity and the one. So, I mean, in The Perils of the One, I made a clear distinction between oneness and unity. Following Pierre Classer's Anthropology of Power in Primitive Societies, what famously he titled Society Against the State, I wanted to show how unity can perfectly exist in division. And if or when it does not, when things become unified, properly speaking, in a colloquial sense, then society is subjected to the metaphysics of the one, to a sort of monosemantic or monovalent condition, which, as far as I'm concerned, is always metaphysical and external. Now, obviously, unity is also not totality necessarily, certainly not in Hegelian terms, at least in the sense that I prefer to keep Hegel in the Adornian perspective that refuses the absolute, where the dialectical is anarchic, no arche, no telos, right? Now, I understand, Gregory, your position that singularity is in Hegelian terms not particularity, and to me this makes total sense. I'm in total agreement. And the way I would only, I don't know if I would add, and I'm not sure we disagree on that, but that also this makes the universal in this respect not absolute. It makes it, in my terms, differential, or as Etienne Balibar has called, ambiguous. It's not the time for me to say more about that. As I told my hosts earlier before we started, although I often say I'm a Hegelian, I am idiosyncratic Hegelian, and I certainly not an expert in Hegel by any means. I'm rather poetic about Hegelian dialectics and not purely philosophical, but we can discuss this more. I would say one more thing, though, before I get to the topic per se, that say, because this concerns me about discussions about singularity, and I also want to hear your views on this. That say the search for the singularity in physics, which comes with a desire and aim for establishing the theory of everything, which is, of course, an absolute, is not attractive to me. If singularity is to mean perfectibility, totality in an absolute sense, not talking Hegel necessarily, it's not an interesting concept for me. It is, if it is closer to impermanence, uncertainty, permeability, instability, even more so inconceptuality, or whatever exceeds the conceptual, or challenges the authority of the concept, etc., then I'm willing to entertain it anew. Then you can say to me, well, what is that really? And, so this is really how it is through this rubric that I want to introduce the topic of listening, which is my new project. And it is so new that I really, it's virtually unknown. I really don't know what it will involve quite. And I don't even know exactly what kind of a book it will be. Certainly will be very different than anything I've done before. In order to give you an idea where I'm coming from, permit me just to say maybe 5 minutes of how I understand this project, and then I can go into what would be more pertinent to the topic. So I'm interested in the meditation and exploration of the notion of listening in a kind of vast terrain of significances and disciplines. Obviously, cultural, historical, political, but also anthropological, musicological, and neurological. I'm interested in that. And aesthetic in the strictest sense of the term, which concerns the work of the human senses, always in relation to other humans, in terms of bodies among bodies. Now, to the degree that I can imagine this project in some sort of completion, I can think of it as a sort of history of, a history of a notion, but also of sets of attitudes, mentalities, and practices, and also a kind of sort of literature, a sort of mythography, as I titled it, I called it in Das Literature Thing, in which a human faculty exclusively attentive to sound will encounter the realm of writing. So I see this in 6 domains. The first one is anthropology and science. I'm interested in how what Gary Tomlinson, in this amazing book called A Million Years of Music, has titled Music, in which he's interested in how a mode of communication among living beings develops, obviously primarily in birds, but it develops also in humans before language happens. And sort of bird song, or a certain kind of sonority, is essential to communication before language. I mean, way before language. And this is a kind of complex argument that would put listening in as a faculty for survival that is no different than the notion of appetite, as a kind of basic neurological drive. So that's the first domain. The second domain, which is what I'm going to talk about obviously more today, is a philosophical one. There's various philosophical traditions of acoustics. I mean, starting with the Greeks, Pythagoras, etc., but also in some interesting Enlightenment ideas. I'm thinking of Diderot's letter on the deaf mute, or La Métrise notion of man-machine. I mean, basically the Enlightenment theories of cognition that were particularly interested in the senses, and the sort of the corporeal before, let's say, the cerebral, if that part can make any sense. Again, you notice how both tentative and inaccurate my thinking is, because I'm just developing it. In this particular domain, though, and this may sound a little odd, but in this particular domain, I'm interested in the great work that's done in the Black musical tradition, especially Black studies, let's say, people like Fred Moten and so on, who really understand, who really elaborate on the notion of the voice, the non-instrumental sound-making capacity of the body, that emerges out of these conditions of a deracinated being that is, of course, conditions of slavery. I think it's a very valuable lesson for us philosophically to thinking from that standpoint. Now, the third would be a more historical perspective. Various sort of listening practices in modernity. I mean, here obviously Adorno would be hugely important. Also, some instances in literature where music and listening is essential in both in plot making and even in creating worlds, let's say. But this historical, which is also linked to, I should say, for me personally, to poetics and poetry, poetry being, as far as I'm concerned, an entirely musical form. But this is also, this historical thing is important to me, specifically in terms of music, because I would say that, let's say after Wagner, I mean, this is a very rough thing, obviously, the genealogy, but, post Wagner, we have a kind of strange and unprecedented heterogeneity in music that takes off in the 20th century, particularly with jazz music and its essential shift in modes of plural and spontaneous composition. Then, of course, rock music, which in interminable permutations of all kinds, them each one actually being quite significant. The kind of experimental music and the breakdown of genres that happen both out of so-called contemporary classical and into the electrification of sound, hence again rock music being important, and then what we are now would call the electronic sphere, and of course the kind of planetary expansion of musics across geographies, cultures, and traditions, and how all these are informing each other and resonating all at once in a way that listening publics are created in a way that I think has not been done before. This is a historical inquiry that I think would be important. The next one would be something that I care a lot about, the relation between music, noise, and silence. I'm interested in the aesthetics of noise as music. This has all kinds of genealogies that I don't need to get into now. The fifth one would be the issue of technology, the technologies of listening. This again has a bit of Adorno, obviously, and Frankfurt School stuff. I mean, the significance of in the early 20th century of radio and phonograph, but all the way, obviously, to the portable media of today and the lo-fi streaming media and so on, and what this does to different ways of being, what it creates certain ways of being, that I think we would need to encounter both in their specifics, but also in a kind of diachronic frame. And the final one is, I guess, perhaps the more familiar in terms of my work before, which I call democracy as a state of listening. I mean, I've made this argument before. It's also in The Perils of the One, that the freedom of listening is more important in democracy than the freedom of speech. The kind of listening publics that are created in polities, in political constituencies, and how they determine politics, especially as they're permeated by the various technologies of capital, et cetera, and media, I think is essential here. So you can see it, generally speaking, a kind of, I'm interested in a kind of ontology that for me is always historical, not, let's say, transcendental, that around this particular faculty or sense, that is essential sort of to human being. And so in that respect, it is an extension from some of the work in Nothing Sacred, but in a domain that I really cannot possibly say that I command, except intuitively, etc., and in terms of my relation to music, which is really my passion. Anyway, so So to return where I interrupt in order to share with you this vision of this project, listening may be a domain of human sense that might exceed the conceptual, that has no need for logos per se, that tends to be corporeal in the cerebral, if I may put it this way. Now I will read a part that I've written now, which is really an attention to a lecture by Foucault on listening, which is specifically trained or upon philosophical practice or the process by which one becomes a philosopher. And then I'll come back and end with some thoughts that are kind of loose in the way that I start. So the sense we have is that in the vast expanses of space between celestial bodies, there is a void, hence total silence. The Greek word for space is diastema, which means literally in between. It's not surprising that the word was used initially to determine the space between sounds, since the understanding of sound, and of course music, was essential in the ancient Greek contemplation of the universe. What Pierre Schaeffer, the founder of Musique Concrète, would come to call the acousmatic experience, the ancient Greeks considered to be fundamental to physics. One listens to the universe before anything else. Legend has it that young pupils of Pythagoras had to spend 5 years in silence listening to the philosopher's words behind a curtain, what later came to be known as the Pythagorean veil, so that in fact the words and their meaning would resonate without interference from the image of the person speaking. Here, both masking, the veil, and silence work together to induce a condition of utmost listening. A kind of embodied understanding requires some sort of de-identification, or perhaps even depersonalization, without the pathological meaning it came to have in psychiatry, of both speaker and listener. The visual representation of authority occupies the terrain of speech and curiously disembodies it by attaching it to a face, a persona. The very Latin etymology of the word contains this essence, the object through which sound passes, altogether literally, persona. It is quite strange indeed, for the face, the persona, is already an image discorporated from the sensuous network that retains signification as a fully embodied experience. This is yet another reason why masks were essential in every mode of archaic theater in a number of societies. While remaining a visual medium, they subverted the privileged relation of the visual to identity. The story of the Pythagorean veil is legend, a mythical structure whose historical authenticity is irrelevant because myth itself establishes an indisputable reality across time. The history of the Pythagoreans is replete with legendary elements. It's not an accident. Their mystical relation to knowledge presupposes and facilitates this mythical structure. So in this respect, the veil is just as much a metaphor for the extensively mediated structure of achieving knowledge. Knowledge is indirect and participatory. No one is a mere reception point, a vessel to be filled, capitalist techno-consumerism notwithstanding. Both masking and listening form a certain language for this indirectness, an articulation that interrupts the need to put a face to a name or a word to a thing. Likewise, silence too is a mask, for it enables a more profound acousmatic exchange, the kind of listening that disrupts one's reliance on mere response to external stimuli. Despite the hegemonic power of information models in contemporary thought, the human animal resists the categorization of machine. It learns to live by creating the knowledge situation, not by obeying it or merely responding to it. In fact, the astonishing thing in the human being is not that it learns, but that it doesn't. The basic notion among the Greeks of listening as learning to be persisted for centuries, even while the Greek world changed significantly in terms of its social and political organization. Foucault has explicitly attempted to it in his research on the practices of the care of the self, which is the key element in the Stoic way of life. A remarkable lecture in the hermeneutics of the subject, that's 1981-82, that has not received due attention is explicitly focused on the significance of listening in the practices of the Stoics. Drawing on Plutarch's essential essay on listening, as well as on Epictetus and Seneca, Foucault exhorts listening as a neglected domain in the process of learning, which for him is an insurmountable element of subjectivation, what he calls subjectivation. Given his interests at that point in his life, his focus was on how listening pertains to truth-telling, which I remind us here has nothing to do with adherence to some concept of truth that one must serve, but rather to parrhesia, the practice of giving voice to oneself unencumbered and unconcealed, a decidedly bodily action of being as such, devoid of ends and instrumentalities. While I will not elaborate here on the complex and different politics of parrhesia in various historical moments of ancient Greek life, I will note that discussions of this notion inevitably center on the function of speech and almost never on listening. This includes Foucault, aside from this unusual moment. And yet, what would be the political meaning of parrhesia without the sort of polity of listening that feels it, judges it, and is permeated by it? Foucault here is reading texts of philosophy while meditating on the significance of bodily practices that would undo the mentality of docile bodies. His purpose is political as much as existential, but because he's reading philosophers, he focuses on listening to logos. Hence his attention to how we listen to words and all that this immediately conjures and opens up. Who speaks the words? What do these words mean? What do I do with the meaning of these words? How do I judge? Yet he conducts this inquiry by focusing relentlessly on the body, how one sits, whether one moves, how one desires, how one is dressed, where does one go from here, etc. And he does so following the terms in which these ancient texts themselves describe the acquisition of listening as a skill, yet a skill that is defined as experience, the word is empiria, not techne. An experience that must then be performed, demonstrated, the word is kind of the same, in order to realize the process of transformation that creates a subject, the process of, in Foucault's words, subjectivation. I really want to underline here that listening is not a technique, but experience. That it cannot just be assumed to be just learned, but also it has to be performed as such. This experience is hardly passive. We're speaking of the exercise of learning, after all. Whether in the context of the mystical Pythagorean myth of the veil or the Stoic de-eroticized confrontation of self and other through teaching/learning, the process is explicitly active, even when it engages, as it must, in the exercise of silence. I remind us again that Foucault makes justly clear that the notion of ascesis, which was essential to the vocabulary of the Stoics, has nothing ascetic about it, as the term has come to be understood in its Christian and subsequently Christianized parameters. Ascesis involves no renunciation, no withdrawal, not even a certain kind of sublimation, particularly if by the latter we allow ourselves tacitly to signify a process of repression or retreat from the body, as does Freud, actually, in essence. On the contrary, the ascesis of the listening experience, which must always involve silence in some fashion, is an active corporeal engagement with the other on the way towards transforming, I would say othering, oneself. I quote here extensively, if you don't mind, Foucault's description of the Stoic, what he calls ethic of listening. So this is Foucault. When you have heard someone say something important, do not start quibbling straight away, but try to collect yourself and spend some moments in silence. The better to imprint, the word is grave, what you heard, and undertake a quick self-examination when leaving the lesson you have listened to, or the conversation you have had. And take a quick look at yourself in order to see where you are, whether you have heard or learned something new relative to the equipment at your disposal, and thus see to what extent and how far you have been able to perfect yourself. And he goes on to conclude, again, Foucault, in sum, good philosophical listening involves a necessary work of attention, of a double and forked attention, On the one hand, looking toward the pragma, toward a specifically philosophical signification in which assertion is equivalent to prescription. And then on the other, looking at ourselves where we see that memorizing what we have heard has embedded itself, the verb is s'encruster, encrusted itself, and gradually becomes subject in the soul that listens. The soul that listens must keep watch on itself, and keep watch is the verb is surveiller, of course, survey, etc. Classic Foucault. So, of course, I repeat, Foucault is interested in the philosophical encounter and the practice of truth-telling. Therefore, his ruminations on listening are specifically attuned to logos, which is to say, inevitably, to a certain semantic register, to language as a specific system of meaning that attaches words to things. My own concern is considerably different, as I care especially for the meaning of wordless sound, what might include words, spoken or sung, screamed, whispered, or vocalized, to the extent that we can bracket their primary relation to things and return to them their simple resonance. I only made a stop here because I find Foucault's account of listening to words whose things, pragmata, are of utmost importance to be singular for its attention to the concrete physical rather than the abstract conceptual sphere, to the body rather than the cognitive mind. Indeed, if we could comport ourselves for a minute and recover from the seductive obsession that the Greeks means philosophy, we might recognize that logos was hardly the most important word in the Greek vocabulary. Instead, one can argue that their evident attention to language was primarily constituted and driven by their express attention to sound. After all, their singular linguistic innovation was creating signs for vowels to attach to the alphabetic notation they inherited from the Phoenicians. The literature on this matter is huge and contentious, but there is no doubt that the phonetic nuances of their language were so complex and essential to meaning that the whole gravity of communication was enabled by a musical sensibility. To quote Flora Levin from her magisterial treatise, Greek Reflections on the Nature of Music, and I quote, "The ancient Greek language was itself a form of melodious expression, since to distort the pitch accent was tantamount to committing an egregious grammatical error." Inasmuch as the disseminated and celebrated imaginarium of the Greeks is a modern European invention, under the semantic compulsion of philosophical/theological privilege, the simple fact that Greek texts were written for the ear first and not for the abstract mind has been denied. Hence, the complex parameters of the practices these texts stirred and substantiated have also been in this respect displaced at a core level, since the adoring moderns played the Greeks for ideas, not sensations, further honing their own constitutive mind-body split. And I'm referring to the entire range of the Greek world, from the cosmological invocation of harmony and violence, and vice versa, as the basic framework of the universe, and the astronomical understanding that celestial bodies are connected to vibrations that permeate earthly bodies, to the raucous intoxication and existential corporeality of the theater and the very essence of politics itself, which in its democratic phase reached a contrapuntal apex. To return then in this light to the Pythagorean acousmatic experience, I would focus not so much on the obvious deprivileging of the hegemony of the visual, but on something more elemental, the separation of the senses. Because then we would see how a paradoxical condition emerges. The separation of the senses works in an opposite way to produce in turn a sort of synesthesia, with listening at the helm organizing the entire sensual aesthetic experience. Indeed, what Pierre Schaeffer saw in the Pythagorean occasion was a model for how sound can be disengaged from its source, whether visual or sonic, so that a new way of encountering sound can emerge, so that the experience of listening can transform the very sense of hearing. We can imagine the Pythagorean veil as a kind of phonograph avant la lettre, a device of separating the sound from its source that is just as technological as any of those devices that modernity claims as exclusively its own. The wager of musique concrète, I'm thinking, Schaeffer here, is how the ear will suspend its impression that sound comes from a person who creates it musically through an instrument that physically makes it happen, so that sound itself can be synthesized as a self-constituted auditory event. Here, the silences in the musical space, diastema, as I mentioned, the in-between, are essential elements of this synthesis. So now I would like to conclude by arguing that the synesthetic experience I'm describing may in fact be an expression of being singular. Now, I realize this might sound counterintuitive, but let's try it. Perhaps we can seek the singular in this Greek prefix of syn, which brings disparate things together without effacing their differences or particularities, but also underlining how this tends toward synthesis and away from analysis, the analytical being a preciously exclusive domain of logic. Now, by this, I do not mean to privilege the notion of symphony. Again, that's another sort of sin. I don't want to privilege the notion of symphony, again, as it has come to be understood by the moderns using the language of the ancients, where some sort of harmonious resolution balances the many different sonic elements. But perhaps, rather, the paradoxical notion of synaphony, the term I made up, which would tend toward an undoing of the privilege of harmony in favor of a juxtaposition of sounds that would strain any automatic assumption of the self-sufficiency of voice as tantamount to person, to individuality or identity. Now, following this strange and perhaps paradoxical idea, we would want to account for how the category of listening might strain the capacity of philosophy. Now, I'm thinking here especially of Jean-Luc Nancy's explicit wondering whether listening is something that philosophy is capable of at all. Obviously, whatever is the response to the question, it cannot be conducted in the domain of logos. But then this begs another question. Can there be philosophy without logos? Now, that's a question I also want to discuss with you. I don't know. In any case, this all hinges on how we adjudicate the double meaning of the word sense. I mean, I was working off of Nancy here, but it works in English as well. Sense as meaning and sense as sense. Or more clearly, the difference between what is sensed and what is sensible. Listening demands that the sensible be sensed before it is thought, or perhaps that what is thought is ultimately what is sensed, before language as such, as embodied creativity in relation to the other. For there is a peculiarity, I almost made the Freudian slip here, for there is a peculiarity, is that a singularity? Question again to discuss. There is a peculiarity to sound itself as a medium that bars even a nominal distinction between subject and object, or inside, outside, etc. It is impossible to speak without hearing oneself speak, barring any sort of somatic or technologically induced infirmity. But even then, think of silent reading or praying, or a hermit in his cave. I mean, by himself entirely, silently praying to God. He hears what he's silently saying. Now, this resonance is prior to having a sense of what one is speaking about, before sense as meaning that arises from logos. Now I understand here, prior is an inadequate term, for it all happens simultaneously in a certain simultaneity. But at the level of sound as such, of resonance, of how what one says speaks always resounds, right? At the very moment that it sounds, this simultaneity of how one listens and understands all at once registers as separation. This is what I mean by synesthesis here. Remember synesthesis as emerging out of the separation of the senses. It is how listening enables us to bring our senses together as separate, not as collapse into one, that I want to underline, okay? Now, is this a way to think of singularity in the terms that the seminar you guys are laying before us? I don't know. I really don't. But my wager is that it may be. If it is, though, it would have to be considered without the tyranny of logos behind it. Thank you. That's it for me. We have plenty of time to discuss things.
You're muted, Alex.
Yeah,
You're...
sorry. You couldn't. I was listening, not talking.
Yeah.
So thank you, thank you, Stathis. This was really beautiful and so much. So many things can be discussed now. So I believe we have so much material and so many elements for a fruitful discussion here. I won't adventure into trying to reply to your last question, namely whether this is the sense of singularity we were thinking about when we started talking about the seminar series, mainly because despite our own theories and our own hypotheses on singularity, we are really interested in, having so much plurality as possible throughout this series. But yours is a very, very beautiful uh, proposal, and I believe we can now start the discussion. We can do it in the following way. Uh, for those who are listening to us through YouTube, please write your questions in the chat, and me or Gregory will be happy to read them to Stathis. For those of you who are on Zoom, on the contrary, make yourself visible in some way. You can raise your hand. You can, turn on your video and, I don't know, do some gestures. You can do it in more than one way. So again, please feel free to intervene. So since it's always, maybe you need a few moments to collect your thoughts, I will use the privilege of being the moderator and start maybe. So I have actually three questions. I will start with one, which is maybe which concerns this notion of synaphony you introduced, because it really made me think about something which really addresses the problem of singularity, time, and harmony, so to say. I was thinking about Paul Ricoeur's analysis of St. Augustine's Confessions in Time and Narrative, when he really stresses out this idea that the analysis of temporality in St. Augustine is structured according to this concordia discordans and
Mm.
discordia concordans. So
Mm.
that in order to address for our experience of time, so time is human time only as far away as only as far as we are sorry, only as far as there is this tension between harmony and disharmony, so to say. And I was wondering whether maybe that analysis in the Confessions could be a good contribution to this discussion of the notion of synaphony, namely listening has this temporal element to it, which is of course pivotal, so to say, and so maybe that allows us to also think about the relationship between time and singularity. I'm sorry whether this is not clear at all, but it was just you know
No,
not a suggestion. It was just something that came up in my mind.
yeah, thank you. It's perfectly irrelevant. In fact, yes, what do you say? This Discordia concordance. They're very interesting. That's very apropos. I hadn't really gone beyond very far in thinking the synaphonia together, but that's actually a good one. I mean, I didn't address time, and that should have. Um, so sound, let's say, well, let's start with a kind of classic problem, right? Which I was trying to avoid because it's a bit of a rabbit hole once you're there. The divergence or the opposition between the oral and the visual, the sonic and the son and the visual. But there is something about sound that is um, that is sort of constitutively expansive, right? I mean, we have a sense of light as being instantaneous. That is because of its, I mean, in terms of physics, of its extraordinary speeds. That simply, I mean, in fact, it's not instantaneous, but it moves in time. But our perception cannot handle that, so it's instantaneous. But we have a perfect understanding of sound, though, as non-instantaneous, as expansive. And expansive does not mean progressively. I don't mean it that way, but I mean in the sense that whatever is the temporality of sound is really impossible to disengage from its spatiality. So so that so what we hear and how we, let's say, process what we hear through the ears, the specific organ that pertains to the faculty, is only partial, because we hear literally with the body all around. That, again, I don't need to explain. We've all been, let's say, to a great rock music shows where the bass just comes through literally into the body, right? It vibrates the body. You don't really hear it, you actually feel it. So that very simple kind of example gives us an idea that it's not just the ear, but it is also, as it has been pointed out, and it's been pointed out by many people, including, Paul Valery and other, sort of people in poetics mostly, that the ear is a strange organ, unlike the eye. The eye has eyelids and that can modulate what one sees, but the ear has really no. I mean, you can't stop from hearing something. I mean, you can put things in your ear to stop it, what is it called? Those headphones, but you can't really, your body doesn't allow it. So, and because your sound comes right through your body in terms of vibration, there's nothing you can do, which means that you're always inhabiting sound in its spatiality, which is one with its temporality. Now, I don't know how I can elaborate this further, really, because your point just makes me think about what I've neglected to discuss, but it's not that I can really discuss it much further. In any case, what I suggest we do, and this is kind of the wager in this whole project, is not bother comparing. We have to kind of be able to deal with sound and with listening, or that whole particular way of being, not in a contrasting framework or comparative with the other senses, but as a kind of elementary, just an elementary being, whatever that means. But you know what I mean? My language fails me. And because I also don't want it to be, because as you notice, I'm painstakingly trying to disengage from logos for all the, that's impossible to do. I mean, after all, I'm talking to you guys. I wrote something, and so nonetheless, that's where I'm tending to. And so the best way to think of this would be to think of a kind of amazing time-space dimension that is particular to this specific experience, which is then not surprising that the ancient Greeks were so attuned to the universe, to astronomy, the way I understood it, and in fact to physics per se, the way I understood it, in terms of sound. I mean, it's not an accident. They really they understood, without understanding the terms that we say today, all right, that time and space coincide.
Yeah. No, thank you. This is very this focus on the spatiality of listening and of the acoustic dimension really resonates. Sorry for the wordplay with me, and I really think it's pivotal. I just wanted to react really briefly, and then I believe there is Greg who will weigh in. The question of spatiality is very relevant, and I was thinking about, you mentioned Pierre Schaeffer, but there's also another Schaeffer, the Canadian Murray Schaeffer, with the notion of soundscape, which is very important for Peter Sloterdijk, who gives a very interesting account of the acoustic relevance of spatiality, or the spatial relevance of acoustics for the foraminization, basically. And he quotes a really beautiful book, which I was thinking about when you started by differentiating listening and language. So by saying that listening comes before language. There is this beautiful book by a French psychologist. I can't remember the name, but the name is La Nuit Utérine, the uterine night, which is basically an analysis of the acoustic experiences of the fetus, of the
In
baby
utero.
before birth. Yeah, precisely. And that's great. I mean, that's a great element because Sloterdijk has this idea that technology is nothing less than a reproduction of this acoustic uterus at various degrees, so to say, throughout the history of culture. So I absolutely agree that the spatial dimension is really pivotal, enabling with singularity as well. This, so to say, tension between spatiality and temporality is really at stake. So thank you for your answer. It's a beautiful path
Yeah, and thank you for
follow.
the reference, La Nuit Terrine. I will definitely look at that. I mean, you know, I don't know if you know, this is okay, science, right? They have discovered that infants, newborn infants, cry differently, meaning that infants don't cry in the same way, just let's say in a certain human animal way. They cry differently according to the sound of the languages, the language of the mother, or the language, let's say, of the environment, that way. And that is something that is perceived in the uterine process, certainly immediately afterwards. Now, so language, I'm not throwing language I mean, that would be ridiculous. What I'm trying, I'm actually very, very interested in the sound of language, obviously. And maybe I should clarify that. I'm privileging the sound of language over the semantics of language in this particular case. Although, as you will all recognize, you guys, I'm not a philosopher, properly speaking. It's to let go of the semantics of language is kind of crazy when we're talking philosophy. I don't know what it means, but that's something that I'm interested in exploring. But thank you for this. I will definitely pick it up.
No, thank you. And also thank you, Francesco. It's Alfredo Matisse, is the name of the psychologist. And so I believe there is Greg and then Kadir.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Very, very rich, as Alex has already said. I have a lot of comments, questions, but maybe I just focus on one for now and then cede the floor to some of our other guests. Yeah, so I'm really interested in the topic, very interested in listening. I mean, in particular because I have passion for music, but I'd like to hear more about why listening per se. What is really singular about, if you allow me to use the phrase, about listening? How does an inquiry into listening per se help illuminate anything about singularity? And I'd like to motivate why I think it does. But by this reasoning that I'm about to present, it seems that also one could also justify an inquiry into other sensory modalities that may also be equally useful in our inquiries into the singular. So I was kind of keeping track of one of the consistent features of your talk, which had to do with the wordless sound, the going beyond the logos, your sympathy to the idea of the inconceptual. So I'm very interested in these features of singular, of at least of certain kinds of singularity. When we think about the singular as, say, an individual or a singular that falls under a concept, the concept, of course, traditionally, it's just a universal. And as a universal, it doesn't individuate what falls under it. And so one might think that actually, like, if I really want to appreciate the singularity of this individual, I'm not going to really appreciate it or understand it or become acquainted with it through the universal. But rather, what I need to do is, say, somehow attend to it non-conceptually. Now, that could be listening to the sound. This could be touching some sculpture or table. This could be a vision. This could be this could be tasting, flavor. One might think that actually these singularities that can't be individualized by the concept are accessible, say, through some sensory modalities, some attentiveness, active attentiveness to their singular being, just as you indicate, beyond the logos, right? And we might, as philosophers, see that we can't actually grasp the singularity of these sounds through our concept, so we actively abandon them to listen, as you say, rather than just say absent-mindedly listening and not knowing what we're doing, say philosophically, not knowing its philosophical import. But then then my question is this: why is it listening that sheds special light onto the singularity of the singular, and not touching or some other, or tasting? Or are they all equally, one could say, valid modes of knowing non-conceptually the singular this that isn't fully individuated by a concept? And then, of course, there's different arts that are related, to these different sensory modalities. So that's just a general kind of broad question that I'm asking. Maybe it's just an interest of yours because this is still early, but I'm interested in whether you think listening really does, and you have this connection with the Greeks and with the tradition. So I'm also curious about that. That's a long question, but I hope it makes sense what I'm asking you.
No, it does. It does.
And just a brief comment about the philosophizing about that which is that singularity that we're not capturing with the concept. One might just say that we can only, I would take the risk and say there's no philosophizing without logos. That's what I would say. But I would then amend this with your point that if I'm going to know the singular as a philosopher and even talk about this experience that is beyond the logos, it's just going to be fundamentally contradictory. That is to say, that will be the logos structure of our language of the singular is of this and this and this, is it'll just be a logos that is without logos. It will be contradictory logos. So for me, then the question won't be, is it logos or not? But it would be, is it a consistent logos or not? At least as regards our talking as we are now about it, right? But so two questions. One is about the listening. Is listening and why is it special there? And then two, the contradictory logos. So thanks so much. Sorry for the long drawn out exposition.
No, nothing at all, nothing at all. So let's start with the second one.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly. I mean, I don't disagree. I think that I don't disagree. I mean, I, I've I've labored for years trying to restage the Platonic argument at the quarrel of poetry and philosophy, obviously in a different way, in favor of poetry, right? Arguing for the performative and the juxtapositional, the paratactic, perhaps even the synthetic against the analytical and the conceptual, the sensuous in that respect. Arguing that, a certain knowledge that is achieved outside of logos, which isn't just simply, we're not talking about stimulus response kind of stuff. We're not talking about that kind of automatic process that all living being, inevitably has to have. Otherwise, it just doesn't exist. But something else that's beyond that, but that is nonetheless does not necessitate concept in order to create knowledge, right? And I'm talking about knowledge that is possible to convey, right? Knowledge that is possible to elaborate on and then to transform, not just simply, some kind of elementary reception. So, and that to me is exemplified by poiesis, but by a kind of what we call a kind of creative capacity, which is always destructive too, creative destructive capacity of form of creating form, and so on and so forth, that does not require a secondary process of reflection. Now, and in that respect, is beyond language. So this is my way of going back to the first question, right? So I have this obsession. I mean, it's been kind of going on since forever. And I'm a poet. I mean, I care a lot about these things. So, and also, of course, some music, because so the easy answer to the first question is just arbitrary. I mean, that's what I like. However, that's not a serious answer. Because there's no doubt that any of the other senses you mentioned, my God, especially touch. I mean, touch, which involves every single cell of your body, right? That is real. That by all accounts, it is the primary sense. That is the closest of all the senses to the envelopment of any being in an environment. That which is both, it's the limit point of it. It's both the boundary and that which is the point of being embedded in an environment, and it's the same thing. There is no doubt that would be that one could do the kind of thing I'm doing with that faculty in mind, and one possibly could do this with all the others. I mean, after all, taste. I mean, Aristotle. We know how important taste is to Aristotle, etc. So I don't, so the so I guess the interest here, apart from the simply, the kind of arbitrariness that is pertinent to all of us, why is it that we choose to write about this or to study this as opposed to something else? It's just an arbitrary thing that pertains to our being what we are. Apart from that, there's something about sound that I'm interested in, so not the sense of, now we're moving to the domain of the medium. I don't know what to call it. Okay. And as I responded to Alessandro before, there is something about sound that moves me particularly and that I feel indebted to. Actually, this is how I would put it, that a lot of my learning in my life is indebted to sound. And it's something about it, that I don't know, it's different. I will never privilege this over other senses. How can I privilege listening over touching, for crying out loud? I'm not even remotely suggesting that. But for me personally, there's something about sound. Partly what I said to Alessandro, but there are many other things. I'm fascinated. I love being immersed in languages I do not know. It's one of my favorite things to be surrounded by language that I do not understand a single thing about it. There's something about this that's just remarkable and makes me particularly attentive. And of course, there's never such thing purely, because there are gestures, there's body language that communicates. So I'm not talking communication and conceptuality. I'm talking about something else that's actually very close to touching. That's why I said the sound is not just the ear, but the entire body is permeated by sound. Now, so that's a very poor answer, really. I mean, I don't disagree with you raising this as a question. I think that is the totally legitimate question. And the answer is, I'm not privileging listening in any sense. It is just simply something that it intrigues me, and I'm trying to understand it, and I'm trying to do something with it that I have not done before. And it's kind of as simple as that. Now, I think that if this particular, let's say, I don't know what to call it, approach or whatever, process or project, whatever, has something to say to the broader philosophical discussions about singularity, etc., the way that you're thinking, then that's great. Then we can talk more, and then there will be other things that we can say that would help me enrich, and enhance, what I'm doing. But so between the kind of my interest in poetic knowledge, non-analytical knowledge, and my pleasure, and because don't just simply interest here, a certain kind of pleasure and a kind of something that I owe to sound, that's how this thing comes together. Now, one last thing I want to make it very clear. I'm not being romantic here. I'm not saying that, the greatness of music, the abstract, all that kind of, I'm really very far away from that. I hope that should be clear. I'm not saying anything of that kind. And hence the difficulty perhaps in even articulating it, because I'm trying desperately to get away from the romantic, colonization of this topic. And so
That
anyway, thank you.
romanticism. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Thanks so
thank
much.
you. No, thank you both. And I'd love to weigh in, but there will be time at the end. We have Kadir and then Michael.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. And I have been recently working on Samuel-Everett's singularity and like trying to capture like what he says about resisting the conceptual, etc. And also like taking some inspiration from Timothy Clark as well. Um, I would like to ask about the how you understand singularity in relation to sound and like let me begin with um, some framework from Derrida because I work most I work on Derrida and singularity in Derrida. So Derrida thinks that like the opposition between the reproducible or you can also say iterable and absolutely singular, which can be considered as beyond or beyond of repetition or like the in opposition to any repetition or iteration, etc. So this distinction between absolute singularity and repeatable concept, iterable concept is problematic for Derrida. He always like
Right.
criticizes it and like mentions it also like in the text as if it were impossible. He says we cannot make these things like totally distinct from each other. So, so my question is about that. How do you understand sound or the experience of listening within the limit between the singular considered as like as the pole of absolute singular and the concept as as repeatability and as imitability, etc. So I couldn't follow how you could put the experience of listening within this limit or without this limit. So that's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that very well. I mean, I am resistant. I said that, but in my writing, it's pretty obvious to notions of the absolute of all kinds, really, and whether it's Hegelian or romantic or Derridian. I'm trying. I find it. I understand it's the great tradition in philosophy, and all that. But pardon me for saying this is really, it might sound blasphemous, but I find it an easy position to think from. And I'm trying not to think from the standpoint of the absolute, which makes it very more difficult for me. Because whatever I say is really open to uncertainty at a core level and to provisionality to such an extent that whatever claim it might make to any whatever truth claim it might have it's just unstable. So this is really a wager, and again, kind of idiosyncrasy. And I recognize that philosophically speaking is you know in very rough waters. But in any case, so I am, of course, attracted very much to the way that Derrida understood that the importance of that which is non-reproducible, which for him is his way of understanding the singular. That which is exceeds or is outside or is unreachable by repetition. But I don't see that as absolute, right? But at the same time, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm interested in what he would find an anathema. at the perfectly substitutable, which is really not repetition either, but it's a kind of, let's say, if I can put it that way, a whole bunch of interminable iterations, or iterabilities rather, that nonetheless can substitute for each other. Now, these two things are completely contrarian. I mean, they are unreconcilably contrarian. So let's try to do this in terms of sound. Now, I think, Greg, you said something that I didn't address that might be relevant here. And I don't know if I understood it right, but the one question is let's talk music actually, just to make it maybe a little narrower. When we actually encounter something musical, do we encounter it with already knowing what is musical or not? Right? Is there a kind of conceptuality of the musical that it works upon our encountering the musical? This is actually an open question. It's an open question. If it were really always the case, then it would be very difficult to imagine and create new musics, meaning new musical sensibilities, including new forms. If, on the other hand, it didn't exist at all, then it would be impossible to talk music at all. So I'm interested, of course, in exactly this kind of untenable situation. So hence my interest in the aesthetics of noise. Is noise music? A classic question, right? And my argument is that it is. Of course, I have to argue this very specifically. And obviously, I have to not only argue it specifically, but I have to account for why it is and why then we use the different words. Is it still noise if it's music, etc.? I mean, that's a very this would be there's something irreducible to noise. It's noise, let's say, but there's also a way to account for noise as that which covers your demands of what music is, whatever those are, right? I don't know if that's answering your question. So basically, I don't think there's an absolute here in any direction. There is no absolute standard of noise. There is no absolute standard of music from which we can actually, where everything is in essence complete in some fashion, or self-sufficient. Everything is open. And that means that in that kind of spectrum, although spectrum is too much of a horizontal thing, I don't want to think of it that way, but in that kind of, let's say, space, then we are constantly sort of pitching ourselves between those two things: noise, music, right? And we reach a point where we don't really care to distinguish. We distinguish only provisionally to the extent that we need to communicate something to someone else who might not understand the difference or might think that we're totally incoherent. Now, logos comes in here and we have to explain. That's why I said it has to be specific. So I don't want to argue that there's something singular, that the singularity to sound. People do that, by the way. Nancy does that. He actually says that outright, that there's something about sound that is the same singularity sound. I'm not ready to do that. I'm a little worried about those kinds of statements. For the reasons in addressing Greg's question, because there's a danger. Someone will say, well, why are you saying this? Why are you privileging this as opposed to something else? Nancy, by the way, Greg, he will quickly will say, well, touch, he will immediately, because I think the moment you hit upon that, you have to roll out of it, because otherwise you're very vulnerable to any kind of critique that would be reasonable. So I don't know if this is really helpful, but let's say, as a general rule for me anyway, my sort of general rule for me would be that iterability, that which is non-reproducible, can at the same time allow for the endlessly substitutable. Now, if that can be understood, then this is really how I prefer to handle my Derrida. To give you a reference for this, I mean, Rancière has done this very well. He's talking politics, of course, but he's done that very well in his critique of Derrida's position in Rogues about democracy, right? And he says it very, very clearly that the only reason why democracy is a different system than any other is that anyone and everyone can occupy the position of rule at any and every moment, regardless of what they are. They're endlessly substitutable. That doesn't change the fact that they're singular, meaning that they are unreproducible, that they are who they are. That we're all different. So it's some kind of simultaneity between radical difference and perfect substitutability or internal substitutability is a way of both accounting for the non-reproducible and the kind of thing that I want to discuss, which is obviously some sort of community and so on.
Okay.
It wasn't very. It was a bit of a clumsy answer, but that's the best I can do.
Many thanks. And Michael, your turn.
Okay, good. Thank you for the really, really interesting talk, Stathis. Thank you. I have two questions. One's a kind of a minor question, and or maybe it'll be bigger as you see it, and then another more general question. The minor question is there a distinction in your way of seeing things between hearing and listening? You spoke mostly of listening, that's your title. But is hearing to be understood differently from listening, and would that be differently related to the singularity, to the singular?
Okay, I thought you had a second one. So yeah, obviously.
I'll have the second one in a minute after you answer the first one.
Yeah. Obviously, you're perfectly right to ask this question. That is a question that has to be asked, and I do think there's a difference. Although, as you noticed, I slipped from one into the other a couple of points without explaining. So when I said, for example, that when we speak, we always hear we always hear ourselves speaking.
Yeah.
I didn't say we listen. I did and maybe didn't. I can't remember, but I did think about it as I was writing it out, even in note form. So listening, we would have to. This is actually a very important question, and not so easy for me to answer. In a very conventional sense, hearing is just a faculty. It's the human faculty, not the human. It's the faculty of living being. To the degree that whatever creatures have, whatever we call ear capacity, oral capacity, that's hearing. It's entirely corporeal sense. Listening would have to be, obviously, it's linked to that. It's not separate. And it's something that I would argue, and I think that both neurologists and scientists, biologists tend to a great number of them agree, exists again in all species. So listening, I don't want to suggest that listening is some kind of human faculty that has been developed via culture and civilization. So, meaning there's a certain kind of hearing that organizes the world in a certain way that would be said to be different from the immediate sense perception of sound coming through. So there has to be a difference.
Yeah.
There has to be a difference. I didn't tend to this difference properly. So you're right to basically raise this question.
And this may be connected with singularity though too, right? Because it sounds like listening as opposed to mere hearing involves a kind of perhaps attending or organizing. And so that's what makes perhaps for the singularity is that involves this kind of activity that's over and above just mere receptive hearing. Is that possible?
Definitely. Absolutely right. Yeah, I obviously need to work on making that very clear. And it's not just simply saying so. I would have to just kind of elaborate on it. But at the same time, I also don't want to privilege. I don't want to create a hierarchy here because that would not be right either. Meaning that hearing is some kind of elementary thing and listening is something
No.
Because or that listening is pertinent to some kind of cognitive capacity while hearing is not. No, because then we get caught in the stuff that I'm actually trying to avoid. So
Exactly.
it's actually it's a very delicate
It's tricky.
point.
Yes, no, I see this. That's good. That's very helpful. The other question I had is about, well, that's come up before, uh, relation between listening and the conceptual. And you said at one point you put in the talk that listening exceeds the conceptual. Perhaps you'd also say listening precedes the conceptual. Um, and I was wondering, could there ever be conceptual listening, or is it something? Is it, or is listening totally different from conceiving?
So that's great. That's great. So I said both exceeds and precedes. You're right about that. I
Uh,
said I didn't use the verb precedes, but I obviously
okay.
described that.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And thank you for that. Of course, I was speaking really specific in my reading of Foucault. It's and the Stoics. I was speaking specifically about the process of listening to the philosopher in the process of learning, right? So
Right.
that's a very very specific domain. And starting with the Pythagoreans, obviously, with the craziness of this idea was, in fact, to uh, to get to the conceptual faster by not
Hmm.
having to deal with the face of the teacher telling you, you know,
Right.
and the body and
Right.
count. So it's a kind of trick, a technological trick for abstraction, for like really quicker
Hmm.
abstraction, which actually takes 5 years, not that quick. But but in any case, so that was very specific to that encounter.
Yes.
So that's number one, meaning that we cannot just say that generally speaking. That is listening to language that is conceptual,
Mm.
that um, that aspires to both a conversation on the conceptual level and to a kind of conceptual reflection,
Mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. So I think that in the philosophical realm, we can't avoid that no matter what. But your question was really more interesting. You said, how did you put it right exactly? You said, can we um,
Can we
not
have,
listen conceptually?
yeah, have conceptual listening?
Conceptual listening. Yeah, I love that. So I have to think more about that. I think yes. That is a great question. I think really, really off the cuff here. I
Yeah.
think that yeah, my hunch is yes. And this would really be this would actually, this would open up my analysis in an interesting way that I have not considered yet. Uh, that my hesitation before logo or before what I call the tyranny
Yeah.
of logos, right,
Yeah.
would be complicated, but not abandoned. I think that it would actually makes it more interesting if conceptual listening is a kind of process that precedes a kind of analytical reflection. I
Mm.
don't know if that's possible, but let's say if it were to precede analytical reflection, then we would have something here that would be essential to philosophical learning.
Okay.
That would be, that be really, really, worth thinking a lot more about, and also historically, where does it occur?
Sure.
Again, Spinoza would be obviously a very important figure to go to there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
His understanding of the body and so on. And I wonder, that's something that I've not thought of, but
Right.
I'm
So,
making a point of that.
right. So if there can be some conceptual listening that's before analysis, prior to the analytical, right? But then I wonder whether the conceptual can go further, can go all the way down, as it were. So you could have kind of non-analytical, holistic conceptual listening, right? And so, and in Leibniz, this is the case, I think, too, because I think for Leibniz, this concept, animals and plants have concepts as well, right? So there's a kind of conceptuality that is very pervasive for someone like Leibniz. And I wondered whether once you allow conceptual listening, then and there's some listening that's conceptual, why not have all listening be conceptual, right? So then but that would become like the making the logos pervasive in a way that maybe you don't like,
Exactly,
right? And
exactly, exactly.
and I don't like that either, but I just wonder
Yeah.
how that would stop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that I don't know about Leibniz, so I don't know Leibniz well enough to really properly answer. But I think that, let's say, no doubt, there's no doubt that animals have, I mean, in a kind of a elementary notion of concept um, as what it, in human language we would call a worldview, which is really nothing other than a kind of understanding of environment, right?
Mhm.
In such a way as for it to be recognizable, and in such a way as if something that is unusual or extraneous be unrecognizable, right?
Mhm.
That's really conceptual. That's a conceptual response
Mhm.
to the other, let's say to the world, and that all animals obviously have that. I mean, otherwise, again, they would not be able to survive. And I
Right.
think so that's an interest, and that's beyond logos. I mean, to the degree
Yes.
we don't know. I
Yes.
mean, when we learn the language of dolphins or elephants, maybe we'll discover something else. But so, other traditions, let's say the Buddhists, for example, one could say they are very keen on this kind of conceptual listening that
Yes.
bypasses the trappings of the analytical.
Exactly.
So it does exist in very, it's not, so it would be very interesting for us to do a bit of that kind of history or genealogy and look at various such instances.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
thank you for this, because it's something I had not thought of.
Okay. Thank you.
Um, if I may weigh in on this really quick, I was wondering whether a difference between conceptual and rational could help here, because I was thinking that maybe what you're aiming to is an aesthetic approach to listening. Namely, I mean, it is very interesting that you mentioned that Leibniz name came up, because basically, I mean, it was the Leibnizian tradition that invented aesthetics as a discipline. And the whole point of aesthetics is there is a form of rationality which is not conceptual, so to say. So there is a way of, so to say, the realm of reason encompasses, so goes beyond, exceeds the realm of what is begrifflich, what is
Yeah,
conceptual.
concept, but yes,
And
concept.
yeah,
But
so in a way, I mean, maybe what we are, because this is also a very a topic that is strictly related to singularity, namely the idea that
Mm.
aesthetics is the kind of discipline that in modernity try to create some sort of approach to the singular, namely, so to say, the conceptual only deals with the universal, whereas aesthetics deals with singularities, so to say. And
Yeah.
in a way, this
Mm.
seems also to be connected in a way. So I don't know. I was wondering whether it could be of some help to say that when you speak, when you and Michael were speaking about conceptual listening, uh, maybe there is a way of thinking about listening in a way that is rational but not conceptual, so to say, which is basically aesthetics, which is basically what aesthetics is all about.
Yeah, although aesthetics, it depends, we're getting now into this kind of nitty-gritty of what the rational might mean exactly in these different discourses,
Mm,
right? And I mean, obviously, the notion of reason can be pertinent to things that are perfectly irrational in another discourse, in a kind of rationalist discourse. I understand that.
mhm,
And especially in archaic terms, that's quite obvious. But then I prefer other elements there, like the performative or the poetic or elements that are or the mythical. And then I wonder what we do with some let's say Freudian idea and Freudian notions, which obviously matter a great deal to me. I mean, things that are that are pertinent to the pre-verbal. I mean, one might argue,
mhm,
Freud doesn't, that there's a certain reason to the psychical. I mean, Aristotle would say that, for example. Um, um, yes, but that's a very peculiar notion of reason. And whenever we use that term, we get caught up in all the, you know,
mhm.
So if the conceptual is bad enough, that too has a whole bunch of presupposed meanings that we have to kind of brush against the grain. The rational has, to me, even more. Maybe, but I know what you're getting at. I know what you're getting at. I mean, if we think of the rational as something that is not abstract, and I understand all that, that can be the case in certain discourses, but you don't really have to make that clear. What discourses you're operating with and what you're employing, and I mean, you really do, because just your readers will just, they're automatically our mind will go to the whatever is the most you know, colloquial or whatever, the most habitual. That's the word I'm thinking of. Understanding.
Yeah, maybe if I could just
Yeah,
weigh
no,
in
you're,
just briefly.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. As you can see, Stathis, we're obsessed with well, we're philosophers, so we want to know about the limits of what we can do. So I appreciate you just entertaining us as we work on our own limits in discourse with you, transcending them. So thank you for bearing with us in our obsession with these limits. But to follow up on maybe two things. One is Alex made this distinction between the reason and the concept. This is a very old distinction, going really all the way back to the Greeks, who distinguished nous from dianoia. Nous, which could be a kind of immediate knowing, and then a dianoia, which is kind of a step-by-step conceptualizing, syllogizing, differentiating, analytic procedure. And in the mystical tradition, of course, this is always really important, that there are these mystics who say, we don't know God through dianoia, but we do get God in nous, right? And of course, they're also thinking about God as the singular. There's the singular, and that's God. We're going to get that through nous or something. So I think there's we have that in this, as Alex pointed out, modern aesthetics, but all this distinction is carved up in different ways throughout the whole tradition, and it just complicates everything. But it's a very important point. Even German idealism, we have the Vernunft, Verstand, and then et cetera, right? So this is a very pertinent distinction that's raised. Interesting, the conceptual listening. I just wanted to note this, neither here nor there. But I wonder whether Michael's point about the conceptual listening isn't already implied. And I was glad to hear that you were open to it, actually, to the idea. So this is implied by the idea you were mentioning in response to an earlier question about the repeatable and the non-substitutable and the substitutable, right?
The non-reproducible and the substitutable.
Yeah, yes, that somehow there is this that which is non-substitutable can itself then be substitutable. We have a kind of contradiction that was raised there.
Oh, yeah, it's contradiction.
Yeah, which is nice, that insofar as it's not substitutable, it is that which is, one could say, transcending all the concepts. So you have this listening, right, that is transconceptual. But insofar as it's non-substitutable, it's also conceptually indistinct from the substitutable, because it's beyond all concepts. So there's no conceptual difference one could draw between the conceiving and the listening in this case. So that's actually very interesting, that it might land you in something like a conceptual listening. Exactly that dialectic that you were laying out about itself is in a certain way bringing you to Michael's question. And so I was very happy to hear you be open to it, because it actually does seem to already be what is implied by your your reasoning.
I mean, because
see that unfold in real time. Sorry,
I didn't hear.
It's interesting to see that unfold in real time.
Yeah, well, that's thinking on our feet. This is what's happening here.
Yes,
but I think that that's sort of, I mean, obviously, yes, I was using conceptual insofar as I was drawing myself away from it or resisting it in the way that it is that you elaborate on according to the Vianya kind of process, the elaborated process,
Yes.
in which also analysis and abstraction and ideas enter in. While the straight sort of nomadic process in Aristotle, let's say, first of all, let's not forget, I mean, you remember that in the work on the psyche, he says something that I think it's I think quite remarkable. I think he says that the translation is that no psyche thinks without a phantasm. And the word thinks is what matters here in this particular discussion, or the word phantasm is the key word, but it's nous. So first of all, the psyche has nous, right? And it has a very peculiar nous, the nous that actually is phantasm.
Yes.
And phantasm, with all the meanings in Greek, have to do with, of course, appearance as well, and light, etc. But also all the other aspects of the phantasmatic. So, which enables us to think of how the imagination and so on is linked to desire, and we can say all kinds of things like that. So I think that if the conceptual, the way that Michael sort of brought it up and the way that you did, can be found in that direction of nomadic, let's say, process, then yes, absolutely is close to what I was discussing. But it's very funny. I kind of blocked it out. I blocked out that particular aspect. I'm resisting the term, right? But you guys, I'm glad you're having fun, and I am just as much having fun in this way. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, we're not talking cross purposes, but I mean, because just the same way that I would, let's say, not reject, but like push up against certain notions that philosophically one would not, the reverse happens, and which is actually good for me, because I'm realizing, certain nuances that I now also recognize. So I don't know, though, whether, again, whether I can do this with a notion of rational, or perhaps I can. I mean, that's an interesting proposition. But yes, I agree with you, Greg. Yes.
Food for thought. Food for thought. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Well, I believe we are past our time, but the discussion was so exciting that, I mean, of course, we are glad. And we have another meeting tomorrow. So I hope there will be time to discuss this further and to elaborate more on these topics tomorrow with Michael's talk. Stathis, you have the last word if you'd like to add something. Perfect. So again, thank you so much for this beautiful talk, and thanks everyone. And the meeting is adjourned tomorrow at the same time, and we look forward to Michael's paper. The link is the same, so you can use the same link in order to connect tomorrow. Again, thanks everyone. It was very exciting. See you tomorrow, and all the best.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
for
so
this
much.
Good day
lovely
or
Bye.
good night, depending on where you are.
Good night, good day, good morning.